March 15th, 1945. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Colonel Marcus Webb studied the reconnaissance photographs spread across the conference table with growing frustration. The images showed the Bielefeld Viaduct, a massive railway bridge in northwestern Germany, standing intact despite being bombed 17 times in the previous 6 months. 17 missions, over 3,400 bombs dropped. Approximately 1,200 tons of high explosives delivered from altitudes between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. The bridge remained operational, carrying German military traffic across the Werra Valley as if American bombers had never appeared overhead. The photographs told the story with brutal clarity. Bomb craters surrounded the viaduct in patterns that revealed both the precision of American bombing runs and the fundamental limitation of the technique. From 25,000 feet, even the most sophisticated bomb sites could not guarantee hits on targets as narrow as railway bridges. The Norden bomb site, America's most advanced targeting technology, could calculate trajectory with mathematical precision. It could account for altitude, airspeed, wind velocity, temperature, and bomb ballistics. Under ideal conditions, the Norden site could place bombs within a 75-foot radius from 20,000 feet altitude. But a railway bridge was not a 75-foot circle. It was a linear target, perhaps 40 feet wide and several hundred feet long, oriented perpendicular to the bomber's approach. A bomb that missed by 40 feet to either side was as ineffective as a bomb that missed by 400 feet. The mathematics were unforgiving. At 25,000 feet altitude, a B-17 Flying Fortress traveled at approximately 180 miles per hour during the bombing run. The bombardier had perhaps 30 seconds from target identification to bomb release. In those 30 seconds, wind conditions at altitude could shift. Defensive maneuvering could alter the aircraft's trajectory. Flak explosions could shake the bomber at the critical moment of release. Once released, bombs fell for approximately 35 seconds before impact. During that fall, they traveled horizontally with the bomber's forward velocity while descending under gravity's acceleration. Crosswinds at multiple altitudes could push the bombs off course. The cumulative effect of small errors multiplied across 25,000 feet of vertical drop. American bomber crews had proven they could destroy German cities. They had obliterated industrial facilities covering acres of ground. They had devastated railway marshalling yards spreading across square kilometers. But precision targets, bridges, viaducts, tunnels, specific buildings remained extraordinarily difficult to destroy from high altitude. The strategic implications were profound. By March 1945, Allied ground forces were advancing rapidly across Germany. The Rhine had been crossed. American and British armies were driving toward the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley. German forces were attempting to slow the advance by destroying bridges behind their retreat and defending bridges ahead of Allied spearheads. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Every bridge that remained intact allowed German forces to move troops and supplies. Every bridge that could be destroyed would disrupt German logistics and hasten Allied victory. But the bridges had to be destroyed quickly, before German forces could either use them or demolish them deliberately. High-altitude bombing was too slow and too unreliable. 17 missions against the Bielefeld Viaduct had consumed resources that could have been applied elsewhere. The bridge remained operational, mocking the effort invested in its destruction. The problem extended across the entire European theatre. Intelligence estimates indicated that approximately 450 railway bridges in Germany remained critical to military operations. These bridges spanned major rivers, the Rhine, Elbe, Weser, Main, and dozens of smaller waterways. They carried rail lines connecting industrial centres to military units at the front. Destroying these bridges from high altitude would require thousands of sorties. Based on the Bielefeld experience, each bridge might require 15 to 20 missions before achieving destruction. The time and resources required exceeded what Allied forces could invest while maintaining pressure on other strategic targets. Moreover, high-altitude bombing created risks that extended beyond simple inefficiency. Each mission exposed bomber crews to prolonged periods over German territory. Flak batteries defended major bridges with concentrated firepower. German fighters, though fewer than in previous years, still threatened formations during approach and withdrawal. The longer American bombers spent over German airspace, the greater the cumulative risk to crews. A mission that required 30 minutes over the target area exposed aircraft to twice the danger of a mission requiring 15 minutes. Repeated missions against the same target allowed German defenses to prepare and concentrate their response. American losses in strategic bombing had been severe throughout the war. From 1942 through early 1945, the 8th Air Force lost approximately 4,700 bombers in combat. Approximately 47,000 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. These casualties reflected the inherent danger of flying heavy bombers deep into defended airspace. But by March 1945, the strategic picture had changed fundamentally. The Luftwaffe was crippled. German fighter production had collapsed under sustained bombing. Fuel shortages grounded most remaining aircraft. Allied fighters dominated German airspace. American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts flew at will across Germany, encountering minimal opposition. The threat that had defined strategic bombing for 3 years, concentrated fighter attacks against bomber formations, had largely disappeared. German flak remained dangerous, but even anti-aircraft artillery was suffering from ammunition shortages and disrupted supply lines. The reduction in German air defenses created an opportunity. If American bombers no longer faced massed fighter attacks, if the primary threat came from ground-based flak, then perhaps the bombers could fly lower. Lower altitude meant greater bombing accuracy. Greater accuracy meant fewer missions required per target. Fewer missions meant reduced exposure to defensive fire. But flying lower also meant flying into the range of weapons that high altitude had previously avoided. German light flak 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons could not reach bombers at 25,000 feet. At low altitude, these weapons would be devastatingly effective. Machine guns that were irrelevant against high-flying bombers would become serious threats. The concept of low-level precision bombing was not new. The British Royal Air Force had experimented with the technique as early as 1940. RAF Bomber Command had conducted low-level raids against specific targets throughout the war with mixed results. Some missions achieved remarkable success. Others resulted in catastrophic losses. The most famous low-level mission in RAF history occurred on May 16, 1943. 19 Lancaster bombers from 617 Squadron attacked German dams using specially designed bouncing bombs developed by Barnes-Wallis. The mission required flying at 60 feet above water, releasing weapons at precisely calculated positions, and withdrawing through intense defensive fire. The raid successfully breached the Möhne and Eder dams, causing massive flooding that disrupted German industrial production. But 8 of the 19 aircraft were lost, with 53 of 133 crew members killed. The casualty rate exceeded 40% losses that could not be sustained in regular operations. The American Air Force had conducted its own low-level operations with similarly mixed results. The most notorious occurred on August 1, 1943, when 177 B-24 Liberators attacked oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania, from altitudes between 50 and 300 feet. The raid achieved surprise and caused significant damage, but 54 aircraft were lost, a 30% casualty rate that shocked American commanders. These experiences suggested that low-level bombing could achieve extraordinary precision, but at costs that made the technique suitable only for targets of exceptional importance. Losing 30 to 40% of attacking aircraft was acceptable for a once-in-a-war mission against critical strategic targets. It was not acceptable for routine operations against the hundreds of bridges that needed destruction. But by March 1945, the operational environment had changed. German defences were collapsing, flak batteries were running short of ammunition, fighter coverage was virtually non-existent, The risks that had made low-level bombing prohibitively dangerous in 1943 had been dramatically reduced by Allied air superiority. The solution came from an unexpected source. On March 14, 1945, a single B-17 bomber from the 398th Bombardment Group conducted an unauthorized low-level attack against a railway bridge near Arnstadt, Germany. The pilot, Captain James Bradford, had become frustrated after watching his formation drop bombs from 22,000 feet that missed the bridge by hundreds of feet. On the return flight, flying at reduced altitude after leaving the formation, Bradford noticed another bridge crossing a small river. On impulse, he descended to 500 feet and dropped the remaining bombs in his aircraft's bay. The bombardier, Lieutenant Robert Chen, barely had time to adjust the bomb sight before bombs were away. All 4 bombs struck within 50 feet of the bridge. 2 direct hits collapsed one span. The near misses damaged approach ramps sufficiently to render the bridge unusable. In 30 seconds, flying at 500 feet altitude, Bradford's crew had achieved what multiple high-altitude missions had failed to accomplish. Bradford's mission violated standing orders. Low-level flight without authorization risked court-martial. Flying alone, without fighter escort or formation support, contradicted every principle of strategic bombing doctrine. The mission should have resulted in disciplinary action. Instead, it resulted in a revolution in tactical bombing that would destroy 300 bridges in 3 weeks and fundamentally alter the final campaign in Europe. The photographs from Bradford's mission reached 8th Air Force headquarters within 24 hours. Intelligence officers analyzed the damage and recognized immediately that something significant had occurred. The precision achieved at 500 feet exceeded anything possible from 25,000 feet. Colonel Webb convened an emergency conference of group commanders, operations officers, and intelligence specialists. The question was straightforward. Could Bradford's unauthorized mission be replicated as standard procedure? Could American heavy bombers, designed and trained for high-altitude strategic bombing, be effectively employed in low-level precision attacks? The arguments against the proposal were substantial. B-17 and B-24 bombers were large, relatively slow aircraft, optimized for high-altitude operations. Their defensive armament was designed to repel fighter attacks, not suppress ground fire. Their crews were trained in formation flying and high-altitude bombing techniques, not low-level navigation and target identification. Most critically, flying at 500 feet exposed bombers to every weapon in the German arsenal. Light flak could track and engage bombers at low altitude with devastating effectiveness. Even rifle fire could damage aircraft flying overhead at 500 feet. A single hit to an engine or critical system could bring down a bomber before the crew could gain altitude. But the arguments in favor were equally compelling. German defenses were collapsing. Flak batteries were dispersed and poorly supplied. Fighter coverage was non-existent. Allied air superiority meant that American bombers could choose when and where to attack without fear of interception. Moreover, low-level bombing would dramatically reduce the time bombers spent over German territory. A high-altitude mission might require 30 to 45 minutes over the target area, time spent forming up, conducting the bomb run, and withdrawing to safety. A low-level attack could be completed in minutes, reducing exposure to defensive fire even if that fire was more accurate at close range. The mathematical calculation was brutal but clear. High-altitude missions achieved approximately 2 to 3% hit rates against bridge targets, requiring 15 to 20 missions per bridge, with extended exposure to flak during each mission. Low-level missions might achieve 40 to 50% hit rates, requiring perhaps 3 to 4 missions per bridge with minimal exposure time during each attack. The cumulative risk-total crew exposure across all missions required to destroy a bridge would likely be lower for low-level attacks, despite the increased danger of each individual mission. 4 low-altitude missions of 5 minutes each meant 20 minutes of exposure. 20 high-altitude missions of 30 minutes each meant 600 minutes of exposure. Colonel Webb made the decision on March 16, 1945. Selected bomber groups would begin low-level bridge attacks immediately. The technique would be refined through experience. Losses would be monitored carefully. If casualties exceeded acceptable levels, the program would be terminated. But if the technique proved effective, if bridges could be destroyed quickly and reliably, then low-level precision bombing would become standard doctrine for the final campaign across Germany. The orders went out that afternoon to 3 bombardment groups, the 398th, 490th, and 493rd. Each group would receive specific bridge targets. Each crew would be briefed on low-level attack procedures. Missions would begin within 48 hours. The crews received the news with reactions ranging from excitement to terror. Low-level flight meant seeing German territory up close, watching details flash past at eye level, rather than viewing abstract patterns from 5 miles up. It meant engaging with defensive fire in ways that high altitude had made largely theoretical. It meant accepting risks that the entire structure of strategic bombing doctrine had been designed to avoid. But it also meant making every bomb count. It meant watching bombs strike targets with precision that high-altitude bombing could never achieve. It meant accomplishing in minutes what had previously required days or weeks of repeated missions. On March 18, 1945, 3 B-17 bombers from the 398th Bombardment Group took off from their base in England, heading for a railway bridge, crossing Weser River near Minden, Germany. They flew at altitudes below 1,000 feet for most of the mission, navigating by visual reference to landmarks rather than the celestial navigation and radio beacons used in high-altitude operations. They approached the target at 500 feet altitude, traveling at 180 miles per hour. The bridge appeared suddenly, exactly where intelligence photographs had indicated. Bombardiers had perhaps 20 seconds from visual acquisition to bomb release. There was no time for complex calculations, no opportunity for course corrections. All 3 aircraft dropped their bombs. 5 of the 12 bombs struck the bridge or its immediate approaches. 2 spans collapsed. The bridge was rendered completely unusable. The mission lasted 7 minutes from crossing into German airspace to withdrawal. No aircraft was lost. Damage from ground fire was minimal, some small arms hits that caused no critical damage. The success was immediately reported to 8th Air Force headquarters. Within 24 hours, orders expanded the low-level bridge campaign to 12 bombardment groups. Within a week, virtually every heavy bomber group in England was assigned bridge targets with orders to attack at altitudes below 1,000 feet. The campaign that would destroy 300 bridges in 3 weeks had begun. The transformation of strategic bombing doctrine was underway, and bomber crews who had spent years flying at 25,000 feet were about to discover what Germany looked like from 500 feet altitude, close enough to see faces, read signs, and watch their bombs strike with precision that redefined what heavy bombers could accomplish. March 21st, 1945, 0645 hours. 490th Bombardment Group Briefing Room, England. Lieutenant Thomas Morrison sat in the crowded room, listening to the intelligence officer describe the day's target with a mixture of fascination and dread. The officer pulled back a curtain, revealing a large-scale photograph of a railway bridge crossing the Prater, Dortmund-Ems Canal near Münster. "Gentlemen, you'll be going in at 500 feet altitude. Approach speed 180 miles per hour. Time over target approximately 90 seconds. You'll see the bridge clearly. It's a steel truss structure, approximately 300 feet long. Your bombardier will have about 15 seconds from visual acquisition to bomb release." Morrison had flown 32 missions over Germany, every one of them at altitudes above 20,000 feet. From that height, Germany had been an abstract landscape of geometric patterns, cities reduced to shapes, rivers appearing as thin lines, targets marked by coloured smoke from Pathfinder aircraft. Flak had been black puffs appearing in the formation, deadly but somehow distant, impersonal. At 500 feet, nothing would be abstract. Morrison would see buildings, vehicles, individual people. Flak would not be distant explosions, but direct fire from weapons close enough to make out individual gun positions. The entire experience of combat would. be transformed from statistical probability to immediate visceral reality. The technical challenges of low-level bombing were substantial and fundamentally different from high-altitude operations. At 25,000 feet, navigation relied on radio beacons, celestial sightings, and radar returns from major landmarks. Bombers flew above weather, above most of the atmosphere, in conditions where visibility extended for hundreds of miles on clear days. At 500 feet, navigation was visual and immediate. Pilots followed rivers, railway lines, and roads. They identified towns by church steeples and factory buildings. They maintained position by reference to landmarks that appeared and disappeared in seconds at 180 miles per hour. A missed turn, a misidentified river, and the formation could be miles off course before anyone recognized the error. Weather became a critical factor in ways that high altitude had mitigated. Clouds at 500 feet meant flying blind, with terrain hidden beneath the aircraft, and collision risks multiplying. Rain reduced visibility to hundreds of yards. Fog could make low-level flight impossible. Missions that could proceed in marginal weather at high altitude had to be cancelled when flying near ground level. The bombing technique itself required complete reimagination of bombardier training. The Norden bombsight, sophisticated instrument of high-altitude precision, was nearly useless at 500 feet. The mathematical calculations that made the Norden effective assumed time to calculate trajectory, time to adjust for wind, time to make course corrections. At 500 feet, traveling at 180 miles per hour, bombardiers had perhaps 15 to 20 seconds from target acquisition to bomb release. There was no time for calculation. The technique became almost instinctive. Spot the target, estimate the release point, drop the bombs, and hope that training and experience had produced accurate judgment. Bombs released from 500 feet had dramatically different ballistics than bombs dropped from 25,000 feet. The shorter fall time meant less drift from crosswinds. The lower release velocity meant less horizontal travel before impact. But the reduced fall time also meant less room for error. A bomb dropped 1 second late from 25,000 feet might miss by 500 feet. A bomb dropped 1 second late from 500 feet would miss by 250 feet, still potentially catastrophic for a narrow target like a bridge. The defensive challenges were equally significant. At 25,000 feet, heavy flak, 88 mm and 105 mm anti-aircraft artillery posed the primary threat. These weapons fired proximity-fused shells that exploded near bombers, spraying shrapnel across wide areas. The explosions created distinctive black puffs that bomber crews had learned to fear and respect. But heavy flak required time to track targets, calculate firing solutions, and deliver shells to altitude. Against aircraft at 25,000 feet, traveling at predictable speeds on steady courses, heavy flak was effective. Against aircraft at 500 feet, traveling at high speed on unpredictable courses, heavy flak was nearly useless. The shells couldn't be depressed low enough, the fuses couldn't be set for such low altitudes, and by the time guns could train on target, the bombers had already passed. Light flak was another matter entirely. German light anti-aircraft weapons, 20 mm, 37 mm, and 40 mm, automatic cannons were designed specifically for low-altitude targets. These weapons could track fast-moving aircraft, fire at high rates, and deliver devastating concentrations of explosive and armor-piercing rounds. A 20 mm cannon fired approximately 480 rounds per minute. A single hit from a 20 mm shell could damage an engine, puncture a fuel tank, or wound crew members. Multiple hits could bring down a bomber. The 37 mm and 40 mm weapons were even more dangerous, firing larger explosive shells at rates sufficient to bracket aircraft in seconds. Moreover, light flak batteries were mobile and could be positioned anywhere. Unlike heavy flak, which required substantial emplacements and fire control equipment, light flak could be mounted on trucks or railway cars and moved rapidly. A bridge that appeared undefended might have light flak batteries positioned nearby, ready to engage bombers during their attack run. Even small arms fire became a significant threat at 500 feet. German infantry carried rifles and machine guns that could reach aircraft flying overhead. While individual rifles posed minimal danger, concentrated machine gun fire from multiple positions could damage aircraft. Tracer rounds could start fires. Lucky hits could strike critical components. The psychological impact of low-level flight was perhaps the most significant factor. Bomber crews who had spent years flying above visible range of ground fire suddenly found themselves close enough to see muzzle flashes, to watch tracers arcing upward, to observe German soldiers manning defensive positions. The abstract threat of flak became immediately personal. Lieutenant Morrison's first low-level mission on March 21st demonstrated every challenge and opportunity of the new technique. His B-17, designated Liberty Bell and marked with the squadron's distinctive identification code, took off at 0745 hours as part of a 9-aircraft formation. The bombers climbed to 3,000 feet for the crossing of the English Channel, then descended to 800 feet as they approached the Dutch coast. The transformation was immediate and disorienting. Morrison could see individual buildings in Dutch towns. He could distinguish vehicles on roads, could make out people in fields. The landscape that had been abstract patterns from 25,000 feet became intensely real farms and villages, rivers and canals, the detailed complexity of human geography spreading beneath the bomber. The formation descended further to 500 feet as they crossed into German territory. Morrison found himself concentrating intensely on maintaining position, while simultaneously scanning for preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Landmarks. The navigator, Lieutenant Richard Hammond, called out waypoints every few minutes, but visual navigation required constant attention from everyone in the aircraft. Railway line at 2 o'clock, crossing our course in approximately 30 seconds, Hammond announced. That should be the Münster-Cologne line. Bridge target is 7 miles ahead, following the canal. Morrison spotted the railway line exactly where predicted. The precision of low-level navigation was actually better than high altitude. In many ways, landmarks were unambiguous, position could be verified constantly, and course corrections could be made immediately rather than waiting for radio beacon signals or celestial sightings. But the intensity was exhausting. At 25,000 feet, formation flying was steady and relatively stable, with only gradual adjustments needed to maintain position. At 500 feet, every gust of wind, every slight terrain elevation change, every momentary distraction required immediate correction. Morrison's hands ached from gripping the control column, his eyes burned from constant scanning, his mind raced to process the flood of visual information. The bombardier, Lieutenant Robert Chen, the same officer who had been aboard for Captain Bradford's unauthorized mission, called out from the nose position. Target area in sight, 2 minutes to IP. The initial point, or IP, was the landmark where the bombing run would begin. For this mission, the IP was a distinctive factory complex, exactly 1.2 miles before the bridge. From the IP, the bombers would fly straight and level for approximately 40 seconds before reaching the target. 40 seconds of predictable flight was the most dangerous part of any bombing mission. At high altitude, bomber formations could take evasive action after race, releasing bombs, immediately turning away from the target and beginning defensive maneuvers. At low altitude, there was no room for maneuvering. The bombers had to fly straight from IP to target, drop their bombs, and maintain course until safely past the structure. Those 40 seconds exposed the aircraft to every defensive weapon in range. German gunners knew that bombers approaching bridges would fly predictable courses. They positioned weapons accordingly and waited for aircraft to enter the narrow corridor where hits were most likely. Morrison spotted the factory complex. IP in sight. Beginning bomb run. The 9 B-17 seconds formed into a tight line astern formation, each aircraft following the one ahead by approximately 500 feet. This spacing allowed each bombardier to watch the preceding aircraft's bomb impacts and adjust their own release point accordingly. The bridge appeared suddenly, a steel truss structure crossing the canal exactly as the photographs had shown. Morrison could see details impossible to discern from high altitude: the individual truss members, the wooden deck surface, even railway tracks running across the span. Then the flak opened up. Tracers arced upward from positions on both sides of the canal. Morrison saw muzzle flashes from what appeared to be at least 4 20mm cannons. The tracers created bright lines against the afternoon sky, some passing ahead of the formation, others tracking toward the lead aircraft. The lead B-17 shuddered as shells struck its right wing. Morrison saw fragments of metal spinning away. But the aircraft maintained course, steadying for the final seconds before bomb release. Chen's voice came through the intercom, steady despite the defensive fire. "Steady. Steady. Bombs away." Morrison felt the aircraft lurch slightly as 12 500-pound bombs dropped from the bay. He maintained course, counting seconds. 1, 3. The recommended procedure was to hold course for 5 seconds after bomb release, giving the bombs time to clear the aircraft before making any maneuvers. The impacts came while Morrison was still counting. The lead bomber's ordnance struck first. He saw explosions walking across the bridge's southern approach. Then the second aircraft's bombs hit, 3 direct strikes on the center span. The truss structure erupted in orange flame and black smoke. Chen shouted from the nose, "Direct hits! The span is collapsing!" Morrison pulled up sharply, climbing away from the target area. Behind him, the remaining aircraft in formation released their bombs in sequence. Some struck the bridge's northern span, others hit approach ramps and railway tracks leading to the structure. The entire attack lasted 90 seconds from IP to withdrawal. Morrison climbed to 2,000 feet and turned west toward England, adrenaline still flooding his system. The formation reassembled, with all 9 aircraft accounted for. The lead bomber had taken damage but remained airborne, its right outboard engine feathered but the aircraft maintaining position. The intelligence photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft later that afternoon showed complete destruction. Both main spans had collapsed into the canal. The approach ramps were cratered and impassable. The railway line was severed. German engineers estimated repair would require at least 3 weeks under ideal conditions that no longer existed with Allied armies advancing rapidly across the region. Morrison's mission was typical of hundreds conducted during the following 3 weeks. The pattern was consistent: visual navigation at low altitude, rapid approach to target, brief bomb run under defensive fire, immediate withdrawal. Average time over German territory ranged from 7 to 12 minutes depending on target location. Average time over the target itself was 60 to 90 seconds. The accuracy was remarkable compared to high-altitude operations. Intelligence analysis indicated that approximately 45% of bombs dropped during low-level bridge missions landed within 50 feet of the intended target. This compared to approximately 2 to 3% for high-altitude missions against the same type of targets. The success rate was equally impressive. Of the first 100 bridges attacked using low-level tactics during the final 3 weeks of March 1,945, 87 were destroyed or rendered impassable. Many required only a single mission, some needed 2 or 3 attacks, but none required the 15 to 20 missions that had characterized high-altitude bridge bombing. The losses were substantially lower than predicted. Of approximately 1,800 sorties flown during the 3-week campaign, 23 aircraft were lost to defensive fire, a loss rate of 1.3%. This compared favorably to the 3 to 5% loss rates common during high-altitude strategic bombing operations earlier in the war. Several factors contributed to the low casualty rate. German defensive capabilities had deteriorated significantly by March 1945. Flak ammunition was scarce. Gun crews were undertrained or consisted of older men and teenagers. Many defensive positions were abandoned as German forces retreated. Moreover, the brief time over target meant that even when defensive fire was accurate, bombers passed through the danger zone before multiple hits could accumulate. An aircraft that spent 30 seconds under fire had far better survival chances than one that spent 5 minutes in the same conditions. The psychological adjustment for bomber crews was substantial. Lieutenant Morrison completed 7 low-level missions during the 3-week campaign. Each mission remained intensely stressful, but the nature of the stress was different from high-altitude operations. At 25,000 feet, danger was abstract flak bursts appearing in formation, fighter attacks developing from distant specks. Crews had time to observe threats, to react to developing situations, to watch combat unfold over minutes or hours. At 500 feet, everything happened instantly. Landmarks appeared and vanished in seconds. Targets materialized suddenly. Defensive fire came from positions that were visible one moment and passed the next. There was no time for contemplation, no opportunity for careful thought. The entire experience was immediate, visceral, and overwhelming. But the results were undeniable. Bridges collapsed, railway lines were severed, German logistics were disrupted. The advancing Allied armies found their path cleared of obstacles that high-altitude bombing had failed to destroy despite months of effort. By April 8, 1945, when the low-level bridge campaign was officially concluded, American bomber groups had destroyed 298 bridges across Germany. The number would reach 300 within days, as final missions were completed and damage assessment was finalized. The campaign had required 3 weeks of intensive operations, approximately 1,800 sorties, and had cost 23 aircraft with approximately 230 aircrew killed or captured. The alternative continuing high-altitude bridge bombing would have required an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 sorties to achieve similar results, would have taken months rather than weeks, and would likely have resulted in higher cumulative losses, despite lower per-mission casualty rates. The transformation of strategic bombing doctrine was complete. Heavy bombers designed for high-altitude operations had proven they could operate effectively at altitudes where every weapon in the German arsenal could engage them. They had done so with acceptable losses and with precision that exceeded every expectation. The campaign demonstrated that air power could be extraordinarily flexible when conditions permitted tactical innovation. The rigid doctrine that had characterized strategic bombing throughout the war, high altitude, large formations, daylight operations, had been discarded when conditions changed and new approaches became viable. April 15, 1945, 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. The after-action analysis of the low-level bridge campaign filled 3 volumes of classified reports, statistical compilations, and tactical assessments. Colonel Marcus Webb reviewed the final summary document, comparing the reality of what had occurred against every prediction and assumption that had preceded the operation. The numbers told a story more dramatic than any individual mission report. 300 bridges destroyed in 3 weeks represented a pace of bridge destruction that exceeded the entire previous year of high-altitude operations. The strategic impact was quantifiable and immediate. German military mobility had been crippled at precisely the moment when Allied ground forces most needed to restrict enemy movement. But the deeper significance lay in what the campaign revealed about the evolution of air warfare, the changing nature of defensive capabilities, and the mathematics that determined when revolutionary tactical changes became possible. The weight of accumulated data permitted comprehensive analysis of every factor influencing mission success. Intelligence officers had compiled detailed records of each mission: altitude profile, approach route, defensive fire encountered, bombs dropped, damage assessment, and casualties. The dataset encompassed 1,847 individual sorties across 300 target bridges with 23 aircraft losses and varying levels of battle damage to returning bombers. The loss distribution revealed patterns that would inform tactical doctrine for decades. Of the 23 aircraft lost, 8 were shot down during the approach to target, 11 were lost over the target itself during the bomb run, and 4 were lost during withdrawal. This distribution indicated that the bombing run, those 40 to 90 seconds of straight and level flight, remained the most dangerous phase despite the brief exposure time. Aircraft lost during approach typically encountered unexpectedly, Heavy. Defensive concentrations positions not identified by intelligence, reconnaissance, or newly established batteries that reconnaissance hadn't detected. These losses emphasized the continued importance of accurate intelligence, even when operational risks had decreased significantly. The 11 aircraft lost over targets fell victim to the fundamental vulnerability of the bombing run: predictable flight path, inability to maneuver, and concentration of defensive fire at the point where bombers would inevitably appear. German gunners learned quickly that bridges under attack would be approached along specific corridors, determined by terrain and tactical requirements. Defensive weapons positioned to cover these corridors could engage bombers during their most vulnerable moments. Aircraft lost during withdrawal typically suffered accumulated damage that caused systems failures after leaving the target area. Engine damage, hydraulic failures, or control system damage that was survivable initially proved fatal when combined with the stress of sustained flight back to England. The survival analysis produced insights into the relationship between altitude, exposure time, and defensive effectiveness. Mathematical modeling based on actual combat data indicated that the probability of an aircraft being hit by defensive fire increased linearly with exposure time, but geometrically with defensive fire density. At high altitude, exposure time was long, typically 20 to 30 minutes from entry into defended airspace to departure. But defensive fire density was relatively low because only heavy flak could reach 25,000 feet, and heavy flak batteries were limited in number and distribution. At low altitude, exposure time was brief, typically 7 to 12 minutes total, with only 60 to 90 seconds over the target itself. But defensive fire density was potentially much higher because every weapon could engage: light flak, heavy machine guns, even small arms. The critical calculation was cumulative hit probability, the total likelihood that a bomber would suffer significant damage across an entire mission. This probability depended on both exposure time and defensive fire density. Cumulative hit probability equals exposure time times fire density times weapon effectiveness. For high-altitude missions in March 1945, typical values were exposure time, 25 minutes, fire density, 0. For relative scale, based on number and type of defensive weapons that could engage. Weapon effectiveness, 0. 6 probability that a hit would cause significant damage. Cumulative probability, 6. 0 relative units. For low-altitude missions during the same period. Exposure time, 8 minutes, fire density, 1. 2 higher due to greater variety of weapons that could engage. Weapon effectiveness, 0. 7 slightly higher due to closer range. Cumulative probability, 6. These calculations suggested that low-altitude operations were marginally more dangerous than high-altitude operations when all factors were considered equally. But the actual loss rate, 1.3% for low-altitude versus 3 to 5% for high-altitude, indicated that additional factors were influencing survival. The critical additional factor was German defensive deterioration. By March 1945, German anti-aircraft capabilities had declined precipitously from their peak in 1943 to 1944. Flak ammunition production had fallen to approximately 40% of 1,944 levels, due to Allied bombing of factories and disruption of raw material supplies. Gun crews had been reduced in quality, as experienced personnel were transferred to infantry units for homeland defense. Most significantly, German defensive coordination had collapsed. The integrated air defense system that had made Germany the most heavily defended airspace in the world no longer functioned effectively. Radar stations were destroyed or captured. Communication networks were disrupted. Central control of defensive assets was impossible. These factors meant that the theoretical defensive fire density, the number of weapons that could engage Allied aircraft, was much higher than the actual fire density experienced during missions. Many defensive positions were unmanned. Others lacked ammunition. Still others were positioned to defend against high-altitude bombers and could not effectively engage low-altitude attackers. The mathematical modeling was refined to account for defensive effectiveness. Effective fire density equals theoretical density times Manning factor times ammunition factor times coordination factor for March 1945. Theoretical density. 1. 2 all weapon types could engage low-altitude targets. Manning factor, 0. 5 approximately 50% of positions were effectively manned. Ammunition factor, 0. 6 ammunition shortages limited engagement duration. Coordination factor, 0. 4 lack of central control prevented concentrated fire. 0.14. This dramatically lower effective fire density explained why actual losses remained below predictions. German defensive capabilities had deteriorated to the point where even the theoretically vulnerable low-altitude approach resulted in acceptable casualty rates. The timing of the low-level campaign was therefore critical to its success. The same operations attempted in 1943 or even 1944 would have encountered much stronger defences and suffered prohibitive losses. The campaign succeeded because it was launched at precisely the moment when German defensive capabilities had declined below the threshold where low-altitude operations became viable. This timing was not accidental. American commanders had monitored German defensive capabilities continuously throughout the war. Intelligence assessments tracked flak battery deployments, ammunition production, crew quality, and coordination effectiveness. The decision to implement low-level bridge bombing came only after intelligence indicated that German defences had deteriorated sufficiently to make the tactic viable. The analysis produced a theoretical framework for understanding when tactical innovations become possible in warfare. Military capabilities exist within constraints defined by opposing forces. When the opposing forces' capabilities decline below critical thresholds, new tactics that were previously impossible become suddenly viable. This concept would influence military thinking for decades. The key insight was that tactical innovation required more than just creative thinking. It required accurate assessment of changing conditions and the judgment to recognize when new approaches had become possible. The bombing accuracy analysis revealed equally significant patterns. The 45% hit rate achieved during low-level bridge missions represented a dramatic improvement over high-altitude bombing, but the variation around that average was substantial. Some missions achieved hit rates exceeding 70%, others fell below 20%. The factors influencing accuracy were diverse and interactive. Bombardier experience. Crews with previous low-level experience showed significantly better accuracy than crews attempting the technique for the first time. The difference exceeded 20 percentage points. Experienced crews averaged 52% hits versus 32% for inexperienced crews. Target visibility. Missions conducted in clear weather, with good visibility, achieved 15% higher hit rates than missions in marginal visibility conditions. Defensive fire intensity. Counterintuitively, missions encountering heavy defensive fire showed slightly better accuracy than missions with minimal opposition. Analysis suggested that bombardiers concentrated more intensely under fire, leading to better target acquisition and release timing. Aircraft position in formation. Lead aircraft achieved the best accuracy, averaging 53% hits. Following aircraft showed declining accuracy, with the last aircraft in formation averaging only 38% hits. This pattern likely reflected increasing smoke and debris obscuring the target for later arrivals. Time of day. Morning missions achieved better accuracy than afternoon missions, possibly due to better lighting conditions or reduced thermal air currents. The interaction between these factors was complex. A highly experienced crew in good visibility could achieve hit rates approaching 80%. An inexperienced crew in marginal visibility might achieve only 15% hits even on the same target. The cumulative effect on strategic outcomes was profound. The 300 bridges destroyed during the 3-week campaign represented a significant portion of Germany's remaining military transportation infrastructure. Intelligence estimates indicated that approximately 450 railway bridges remained critical to German military operations at the start of March 1945. Destroying 300 of these bridges in 3 weeks crippled German logistics at a critical moment. The effect on German military mobility was quantifiable. Rail transport of military supplies across Germany declined by an estimated 60% during April 1945 compared to March. This decline resulted directly from the loss of bridge capacity. German forces attempting to shift defensive positions found movement impossible when bridges were destroyed. Supply convoys could not reach forward units. Ammunition and fuel stocks could not be replenished. American ground commanders reported that German resistance began collapsing in early April, with many German units surrendering rather than continuing to fight without supplies or reinforcements. While multiple factors contributed to German military collapse, the disruption of logistics through bridge destruction played a measurable role. The timing of the bridge campaign aligned perfectly with the final Allied offensives across Germany. American and British forces were advancing rapidly, seizing territory at rates that would have been impossible if German forces could have moved freely to defensive positions. The bridge destruction prevented German tactical mobility at precisely the moment when such mobility was most critical to organizing effective defense. The broader implications for air power doctrine were recognized immediately. The success of low-level precision bombing against bridges suggested that similar approaches might be effective against other target types that had proven difficult to destroy from high altitude: viaducts, tunnels, specific buildings, and industrial facilities where precision was critical. The 8th Air Force began planning expanded low-level operations against a wider array of targets. These plans were never implemented. The German surrender on May 8, 1945, came before additional campaigns could be launched. But the doctrine had been established and the viability demonstrated. The Pacific Theater began planning similar operations against Japanese bridge infrastructure. The success in Europe suggested that Japanese bridges on mainland Asia could be destroyed using the same techniques. These operations were scheduled for summer 1945, but were rendered unnecessary by Japan's surrender in August. The mathematical analysis of the campaign produced insights that would influence bombing doctrine for decades. The relationship between altitude, accuracy, and exposure time became a central consideration in mission planning. The recognition that tactical innovation depends on changing defensive capabilities influenced how air forces approached operational planning. Most significantly, the campaign demonstrated that strategic bombing could be far more flexible than the doctrine of 1942 to 1944 had suggested. The rigid adherence to high-altitude formation bombing had been driven by the defensive environment that existed during the war's middle years. When that environment changed, tactics could change accordingly. This flexibility would become a defining characteristic of post-war air power. The concept that tactics should adapt to changing conditions rather than remaining fixed by doctrine would inform military aviation for generations. The low-level bridge campaign of March-April 1945 lasted only 3 weeks and involved relatively small numbers of aircraft compared to the massive strategic bombing campaigns of previous years. But its impact extended far beyond the immediate destruction of 300 bridges. The campaign demonstrated that air power could achieve strategic effects through precision rather than mass destruction. It showed that tactical innovation could succeed when properly timed and informed by accurate intelligence. It proved that even large, heavy bombers designed for specific roles could be effectively employed in dramatically different ways when conditions permitted. Most importantly, it revealed that the mathematics of warfare, the calculations of probability, exposure, effectiveness, and timing could be understood and manipulated to achieve decisive effects with acceptable costs. The thousands of bombs that had missed the Bielefeld Viaduct from 25,000 feet had taught the same lesson as the few bombs that destroyed it from 500 feet. In warfare, as in all things, altitude matters less than accuracy, and timing determines everything. By the time Colonel Webb signed the final report in late April 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over. German forces were collapsing across the entire front. The bridge campaign had contributed to that collapse, but it was one factor among many. The overwhelming superiority of Allied forces in every dimension, manpower, material, logistics, and air power, had made German defeat inevitable. But the manner of defeat mattered. The speed of Allied advances, the inability of German forces to organize effective resistance, the collapse of military transportation, all these outcomes were influenced by the destruction of 300 bridges in 3 weeks. The bomber crews who had flown those missions at 500 feet altitude, who had seen Germany up close rather than from abstract distance, who had dropped their bombs with precision rather than statistical probability, had participated in something historically significant. They had demonstrated that old equipment could be used in new ways, that doctrine could be flexible, and that innovation could succeed when informed by clear thinking about changing conditions. The lessons would resonate through the decades of air warfare that followed, informing how military forces approached tactical innovation, how they balanced risk and reward, and how they recognized when revolutionary changes had become possible. The mathematics of the campaign, 1,847 sorties, destroying 300 bridges at a cost of 23 aircraft, told a simple story. But beneath those numbers lay insights about warfare, technology, and human adaptability that would influence military thinking long after the bridges were rebuilt and the war was forgotten by all but those who had lived through it.